So when I was younger, I went on a missions trip to Africa, and we stayed out in the bush, witnessing to these tribes that had very little contact with Western civilization. And so we would talk to them about Jesus and about becoming a Christian. And one of the major sticking points was polygamy. A lot of these African men, it was a status symbol to have many wives. And the missionaries that I was with would tell them, well, if you become a Christian, you have to give up your wives. You're only allowed one. And as a surprise to no one, they decided to decline, more often than not. And a big reason that Christians feel this way is because they look at Adam and Eve in the garden, and they see this as a model for how relationships are supposed to be. A man and a woman. God made them that way. That's the model. However, there are many, many examples in the Bible where this model was not followed, and people practiced polygamy. Jacob had 4 women that he slept with, 2 wives and 2 concubines. David had 8 wives. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. I don't know how that would be so many trips to Target today. And these people I mentioned are generally considered to be good people. I mean, Jesus came from the line of David. David was said to be a man after God's own heart. So what's the deal? Did they know that they were supposed to be monogamous and they just overlooked that? They followed God mostly, except in this one area. Did they get a free pass because they did some great things in history? Do we just let it slide because that was a different culture back then? And what does the Bible have to say? Let's take a look.
Attention, bargain shoppers.
So let's begin by taking a look at how polygamy was regarded in general. This is something that the ancient Jewish people considered to be normal. And they had been practicing it all the way back since Genesis chapter 4, where we see one of Cain's descendants had multiple wives. Pretty early on. Genesis 4:19 reads, Lamech married 2 women, one named Adah and the other named Zillah. So starting all the way back to pretty much the start of humanity, for multiple thousands of years, people practiced polygamy. This began to change, however, when the Romans took over closer to Jesus' day. The Romans sort of viewed polygamy as immoral, and it was outlawed in the Roman Empire for the most part, which was very strange to me, because the Romans were not monogamous. They definitely had parties where they participated in orgies, and they had men who had concubines and mistresses. But I guess their official policy on the governmental level was monogamy. And the Roman and the Greek culture had a big influence on human history and the world, basically, from that point moving forward. And the Jewish people were no exception. They were heavily influenced by this. When the Romans first took over, they allowed the Jewish people to practice polygamy, but over time, just through cultural diffusion, the Jewish people began to adopt this idea of one wife. And by the time Jesus rolled around, they were pretty much just practicing monogamy. So that's kind of the history in a nutshell. But why did the ancient Israelites behave this way in the first place? What is the theology there? Well, the ancient law given to the Israelites by God made provisions for polygamy. If we look at Deuteronomy 25:5, we're told, brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son. His widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Or we can look at Exodus 21:10, which reads, if he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. We need to be careful when interpreting Scripture because it's very easy to fall into a trap. The trap of adopting kind of a skewed narrative to make uncomfortable verses fit a little better into our modern sensibilities. I've heard people say Jesus refutes polygamy when he says things like, and the 2 will become one flesh, so they are no longer 2, but one flesh. And people say, well, he said the word 2, so that must only mean 2. 2 could become 1, but 3 can definitely not become 1. Well, it's not really what Jesus is saying here. He did say this, yes, but he's speaking here on the importance that God places on marriage. He's not commenting on the structure of it. In fact, that verse we just read in Deuteronomy was referenced in the New Testament. In Matthew 22, some religious leaders are trying to trip up Jesus. They come to him and say, Moses told us that if a man dies without having children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring from him. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first one married and died, and since he had no children, he left his wife to his brother. The same thing happened to the second and the third brother, right down to the 7th. Finally, the woman died. Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be of the 7, since all of them were married to her? So they're trying to catch Jesus in a little bit of a trap here. And Jesus had the opportunity to address polygamy, but instead he talks to the heart of what they're actually trying to get at, the resurrection. Jesus replied, "You are in error because you do not know the Scriptures or the power of God. At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven." The truth is, and this might be uncomfortable for some people, the Bible never commands or condemns polygamy. But Adam, I hear you say, did we not just read 2 verses where God did command it? Actually, no. God laid out rules for governing it. This is different than commanding it. You see, a huge purpose for the Levitical laws was for God to reveal his character to his people. And in both these verses we looked at, God is commenting on fairness and on mercy. Let's look at them again. Deuteronomy 25:5 says, "If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Your husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her." You see, back then women weren't allowed to hold jobs. So if your husband died, you're essentially on the street. You have no way to provide for yourself. So in this verse, the Bible is instructing her family to take care of her. They make a way for her, to provide for her. Same thing in Exodus 21:10. "If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights." These are verses that are speaking to fairness and equity within the household. I actually see the theology of polygamy very akin to the theology of slavery in the Bible. In Ephesians 6:9, we're told, "Do the same for your slaves. Give up your use of threats because you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him." And this is a verse that has been used to justify slavery throughout history. However, this verse is not speaking to the institution, it's speaking to the heart. Don't use threats with your slaves. God doesn't have favorites. When you get to heaven, you will be judged by your actions. That's the message to be taken here, not slavery is okay, or not okay for that matter. When we interpret Scripture in the Bible, we need to look at what it's actually speaking to and not what we're wishing it is speaking to. And here's the thing, at the end of the day, God and his son Jesus were always more concerned with the hearts of the individual more than the institutions. Jesus was always more concerned with the spirit of the law than the letter of the law. People were always trying to drag him into political conversation. Should we pay taxes? Should we obey the government? And Jesus always brought it back around to individual accountability. I know as human beings, we love our little boxes. We love to have everything written out nice and neat. But the truth is that Jesus was always more concerned with people than with policy. I mean, you could have somebody in the Old Testament who has 2 wives, who was a really good, loving husband to them. We could have somebody nowadays who is a terrible husband and is abusive. And God was always more concerned with how people conducted themselves than the institutions with which they operated in. So that's what I got for you today, and I'd love to hear your comments below. It's an interesting one. I'm sure you'll have thoughts. I'll leave the verses used today in the description. Please feel free to like and subscribe. It does help out the channel. My name is Adam. This is Bargain Bin Theology, and remember, you get what you pay for.